Hello, my name is Mary Mack. I'm the Executive Director of ACEDS, the Association of Certified E-Discovery Specialists, and I am extremely pleased to bring you a very timely and very important webinar for our community entitled Protecting Data in the Age of Cybercrime and Data Breach, Practical Guidance for Securing Data in Motion. And this webinar is brought to you by our affiliate partner, Logical, and features fantastic panelists to discuss this. And as I described their bona fides, if you look at the lower right of your screen, you'll see a Q&A box. You can type your questions into that box, and if it's a question that applies to what's being talked about right in the moment, I'll interject and interrupt. And if it's something that's coming up in the future or not on our topic, we'll save it towards the end, and we will have time for questions towards the end. I'm absolutely thrilled to have Robbie Hilson, the Senior Marketing Director over at Logical, as moderator and participant on this, organizer of this webinar. Robbie was the Executive Director of ACEDS prior to me, and I stand on the shoulders of a giant. Thank you, Robbie, and I love that you're back in your new role speaking with our ACEDS community. I know everybody has missed you. And with him is Asim Gupta, who is a senior corporate counsel at Salesforce. And prior to going in-house, he was at the early adopter e-discovery firms of Sidley and Howery. And Asim is responsible for the e-discovery in litigation over at Salesforce. And then we also have Colin Seze with us, and he is a 6-year veteran of Logical and responsible, of course, for customer success, and has seen the company through its evolution from services into a SaaS model. And we'll have some, I'm sure there's quite a difference between security there and security in the SaaS model. So with the three of them, and then your questions that I'll be looking for in the Q&A panel. I'll turn this over to Robbie, and Robbie, you've got some CLE possibly for this session as well. So Robbie? You're still on mute, Robbie. Still on mute.
Hey guys, I can't unmute myself from this end. Can you hear us now?
Now I can hear you. Yep. Thank you, Robbie.
All right, you can hear us now.
I can hear you now. Did we say this was one of those telecom kind of webinars?
All right. Well, hopefully the rest of the presentation will go a little bit more smoothly. But thank you for that very nice introduction. Asim, do you want to say hi so that people can hear your voice and know when you're talking?
Yeah, this is Asim. Can everybody hear me?
All right, great. Thanks, Asim. And
we can.
We got Colin. We got Colin as well.
Hello. Thanks for the intro.
Good, Colin.
All right, so yeah, we do have CLE credit available for this presentation in California, and then we have reciprocal credits as well. We'll show our contact information at the end of the presentation, and if you would like to apply for CLE, you can email either me or Colin, and we'll help you get started. So with that, let's talk about our agenda today. First, we're going to start out talking about kind of why we're doing this presentation now and why issues of data security have become such a critical issue for the legal community over the last 12 to 18 months. Then we'll talk a little bit about why law firms are especially challenged in this area and why they're increasingly becoming, as we will see, targets of cybercrime and are increasingly experiencing data breaches. We'll talk briefly about some of the ethical and professional obligations that bear directly on cybersecurity. And then finally, we'll look at some of the risks specifically related to kind of the e-discovery process as we all know it, kind of that EDRM-driven model. And then we'll spend kind of the final few minutes talking about ways that we can kind of work together to shore up some of those risk points. So with that, let's talk about kind of the cybercrime landscape. So while we were talking, while I was fiddling with trying to unmute my microphone, somebody somewhere lost about 2,000 records as a result of cybercrime or data breach, or at least that's what the statistics say. There's a common adage in the cybercrime intelligence community. There are two types of organizations, either those that have been breached or those that don't know they've been breached. And in 2017, that's definitely becoming, that adage is becoming true. Data breaches are increasingly becoming the rule, not the exception to the rule. And so you look at some of these stats on your screen. In the last 3 years alone, more than 6 billion records have been lost as a result of thefts or loss. And the average cost of a single breach is coming on the order of about $4 million. And the scary thing is that only about 4% of all these files that have been lost over the last few years have been encrypted, which means the other 96% can be used for insider trading and ransomware and stuff like that. So this is increasingly a problem, and it's specifically a problem for the legal community. In the last 12 months, a lot of these things have kind of come home to roost. So there's long been a perception, and Mary, you touched on this when we were just talking before the call, but there's long been this perception that law firms are generally laggards when it comes to cybersecurity. And several major headline-making events in the last year have really put a fine point on that. So let me just kind of touch on a few of them briefly. So in March, you guys have probably heard about this. It was reported that 2 top corporate law firms had suffered breaches by Chinese hackers that were basically looking for materials related to the M&A practices of those specific law firms so that they could use them for the purposes of insider trading. Those people were indicted, I believe, in December, and news broke about kind of how they were stealing some of that information. And what turns out was the case is that basically these people were breaking into the email servers of some of these law firms. They were targeting certain partners who were in these M&A practices, and they were basically picking off emails as they were being sent. And so they would go into the servers for an hour, pick off a few emails, come out, and do the same thing over and over again. And it was because these firms in question did not have kind of secure networks. So that was in March. That was followed in April by kind of what we all know now just as the Panama Papers. There was a big Panamanian law firm, Mossack Fonseca, that they exposed about 11.5 million documents related to past and current clients. And this was kind of a really big story because a lot of those clients were well-known world leaders. And it turns out that a lot of them appear to have kept some of their assets in offshore tax havens. So that was in April, and then finally in May, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in detail, but a top Chicago law firm was sued for malpractice for storing client data without adequate security. And that was the first known legal malpractice suit specifically alleging lax data security. So let me pause there, and Asim, I want to ask you a question. You're at Salesforce now, but before you were at Salesforce, you worked for several large law firms. I want to just ask you, like, how that experience of working at law firms has informed the way in which you're working with outside counsel now in the context of e-discovery and some of these cybersecurity questions as well.
Yeah, sure. So obviously, when I was at the law firm, I was on kind of the other side of the fence as outside counsel and really saw what happens to documents, emails, et cetera, when they come over to the firm and how they are handled by the firm and how they're handled by outside e-discovery vendors, sort of under the old model of e-discovery. So coming in-house, I really have a really good idea of how our data is treated when it's sent over to law firms under the old model. Now, obviously, before the days of Logical, there was really only one way of transferring that information, and it was done as securely as possible, and was treated, as securely as possible by the law firms. But obviously, that's not that level of security, that level of treatment of the data isn't at all the same as kind of what it is today with new systems like Logical.
Yeah, that's really good feedback. And Mary, I'm curious to know from you, I mean, obviously ASEDS has covered a lot of this stuff over the last year. What have you seen in terms of some of the consequences on the law firm side that some of this news is bringing to bear?
Well, I think from our perspective, there's a heightened awareness, especially amongst early adopters. You'll see the people who've been working in e-discovery for quite a while taking a much bigger interest in security and learning about security. I think that some of the firms have actually budgeted money for both technology and personnel, but then again, with the business model of law firms, it's very difficult to invest what you need to invest to secure, to totally secure your organization, and you have so many moving parts. So there's a lot of frustration on how do you herd the cats to get them moving in the direction of being more secure before the unthinkable happens.
So that's a really good point, and it kind of dovetails into this next slide. There's often this assumption on the part of the client sometimes that because law firms are bound by confidentiality or because they might have, really high profile or experts in their area, that the relationship between the attorney and the client is privileged. There's this assumption that information entrusted to those law firms is always secure, right? But as we've seen, that's not always the case, and in fact, some would argue, including the guy you see here on your screen, a guy named Ellie Wald, who's a leading ethicist at the University of Denver College of Law. These people would argue that law firms are among the most vulnerable institutions to hacking and data breach. And there are kind of a couple reasons for this. So first, law firms today act essentially as databases for client data. They're increasingly holding all of this raw unprocessed data for their clients, and that represents a particularly valuable trove. And Mary, as you were saying, as Asim alluded to, their data security standards usually aren't up to those of their clients. And then another interesting point is that for hackers, law firms represent what we call almost an efficiency play. So because they hold the data of many clients instead of just one, the hackers might look at that and say, well, instead of breaking into Apple and Walmart and all these other companies, we can just go right to the law firm who is hosting all of this data because they represent all of these different companies. And then the final point to make is that law firms tend to hold, because it's already been culled down kind of on the client side, the stuff that they hold is kind of the cream of the crop. So it is the most valuable data. So, Asim, let me ask you, and Mary made this point, but how do you view the security levels of the firms that you guys are using compared to kind of your own internal measures at Salesforce? I mean, do you guys see yourselves as kind of setting the bar for security and your law firms maybe lagging behind in that regard?
Well, I mean, I'd like to think that Salesforce is pretty much at the top of the pile when it comes to data security, and obviously, for our own customers, data security one of the highest priorities. So, you know, we treat our own data in the same way because obviously, you know, data security is top of mind. So we have our own data security teams that evaluate, you know, our vendors and things like that. And obviously, our law firms that we use have data security top of mind as well. They just may not have the resources or know-how to implement data security programs in the same way that we might implement them. So, you know, all of our law firms that we work with are top law firms, and they understand that the data that we're giving them is confidential. But, you know, I think there's a slide coming up here where we're going to see how that data is passed along under the old model between the law firm and maybe some e-discovery vendors. So, you know, I really for us, when we do send the data to the law firms, we trust that they're going to take care of it in the way that they, you know, we might expect them to, but it is a bit of a black box. We don't know exactly how and where the data is, you know, once it does go to the law firm for obvious reasons. So, you know, to answer your question, you know, we do view our own security standards as, you know, probably being higher than those at a law firm.
Yeah, we have a question of whether the panelists recommend law firms undergo a SOC 1 or SOC 2 report, like a third-party assessment.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is Colin. You know, law firms, their practice is not generally security. They're subject matter experts or content experts. That said, you know, the responsibility they can't defer by using other providers, absolutely, right? Why not? And we'll touch on this more later, but whether it's a formal process that actually carries a stamp or it's just a list of questions that we should be asking ourselves, absolutely.
Thank you.
And Asim, just to piggyback on those comments you made, when you guys do engage, let's just set aside law firms for a second, but when you do engage outside vendors, are they going through a security audit? And if so, like what are some of the things that you're specifically looking at?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when we are engaging outside vendors, when we're using sort of online systems, yeah, they go through a security audit. But when we're using, you know, other types of vendors, you know, if we were to go to an outside e-discovery vendor where we, you know, wouldn't necessarily be kind of using a SaaS system, they don't really go under any sort of security review. I mean, and just to point out, you know, when we're engaging a law firm, oftentimes we're using, you know, big law firms that we used before, but there are times when we have to use law firms, you know, regional law firms or smaller law firms, and obviously, you know, we don't have the ability, no company really has the ability to do a full security audit before you engage them. I mean, these are litigation matters that move quickly, so you have to just engage, you know, a firm and move forward. So doing the security audit of their how they treat data is pretty much impossible.
Okay, interesting. So I mentioned a couple slides ago that the first ever legal malpractice suit for poor data security had been filed. This is just one of the cases. Apparently there are 15 or so others that have been filed but have not been unsealed. And I wanted to spend a little bit more time on that because it is a major development. So just to kind of set the stage, the focus of this particular complaint was on the firm's outdated billing systems. And basically, long story short, the billing systems were kind of publicly available over the internet, and they were also hooked up to the firm's internal systems, which meant that basically anybody with access to this specific link could access the billing systems, and then, you know, if they wanted to, could kind of dive into the firm's internal systems as well. So in this sense, like the billing system almost acted as like a beachhead for their entire internal systems. And I'll just kind of read out some of the allegations that are made in this complaint. The defendant's computer systems suffer from a critical vulnerability in its internet accessible web services. As a result, confidential information entrusted to Johnson & Bell by its clients has been exposed and is at great risk of further authorized disclosure. Again, these include, among others, a time entry system, a virtual network system, an email system, et cetera, et cetera. So it wasn't just this one billing system. And then defendant systems, they do not limit access to individuals with valid usernames and passwords, and this is kind of the key point. Instead, hackers can breach its systems with impunity because defendant had improperly configured the service and left it running out of date software. And then to a point we were making before, the complaint says, and because hackers and corporate spies covet such data, this law firm is a target for such an attack. So it really just goes to show that, these plaintiffs' firms suggest too that, law firms are kind of a highly valuable target for hackers. So, Colin, let me bring you in here. Obviously, in the last 12, 18 months, data security has become a much bigger issue in the legal community. What are some of our customers specifically asking you about, and how are we kind of consulting with them on some of these issues?
Yeah, sure. So the conversation has changed greatly in the past couple of years. And the focus today largely is security, right? How are documents being treated? How's the data being handled? Where does it go, or where does it not go? And so some of the trends there, more specifically, we see are, and not just our customers, but I talked to a lot of prospects, people shopping, right, for discovery solutions, and shifting the data, the responsibility, right, of keeping that data safe away from on-premises solutions. Instead of a law firm kind of having to wear that hat as the IT security expert, and some firms do that very well. Some firms have great, strong central IT departments, as I think we all know, many do not. And so shifting that responsibility into the hands of an expert in the field, right? Companies like Salesforce that specialize in data security is a very big trend. Passing the liability as well, right? Law firms are risk averse, are risk averse by training, and that's something that is a good fit for their practice, right? Moving that responsibility into the hands of experts, and reducing how much client data is handled, right? I think a lot of the older models, especially looking back at the history of discovery services, you have a lot of people, right? A lot of hands on the data, both in transit and when it's actually being worked on, and there's a lot of unknowns there. So a lot of the questions that we're fielding today are related to, where does the data go, and who has access to it.
Those are really good points. And just one other thing that I think I hear a lot, and you probably hear a lot too, is that law firms, we mentioned earlier that a lot of them are handling all this unprocessed data, client data, and a lot of times it's just kind of sitting on their servers. They're looking to offload that to someone else, right? Either put it in the cloud or have another vendor host it or whatever. That's something I see. Is that something you see as well?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, excellent. So moving to this next slide, not to kind of dwell on this too much, but these numbers just kind of drive home the extent of the problem that we're talking about here. There are a few kind of big numbers I want to call out. So one is that one you see in the middle. The company, the cybersecurity company Mandiant, did a study a few years ago, and they found that more than 3/4 of the largest 100 law firms in the United States not just have suffered a data breach, but have been hacked by cyber criminals. So there's that. And then again, we talked about this, but the average cost of a data breach is coming up on about $4 million. The interesting thing, one of the interesting things is that despite kind of all of this cyber criminal activity, it's still the case that about 3 in 4 of these firms have not kind of gone through the process of assessing what a breach would mean to them, which is interesting because to kind of highlight this final circle, 90% of these breaches are preventable, and we'll talk about some of the things that you can do to prevent these in a few slides. But first, let's briefly kind of touch on the professional and ethical obligations that are related to data breach. Obviously, lawyers have a general obligation to protect client confidentiality. They also have a duty to stay up to date with how technology is being used and some of the related risks that technology poses. So ABA Model Rule 1.1, as many of you know, a comment, I believe comment 8 to it was amended a few years ago to specifically say that attorneys have to stay abreast as to the benefits and risks associated with relevant technology. And perhaps kind of the most forceful stating of that idea came from the California Bar out here, which they said earlier last year in an ethics opinion that they published, they said that in order to be considered competent to practice in complex litigation, attorneys have to either understand the issues that e-discovery poses, they have to rely on someone who does if they don't understand the issues. So somebody like co-counsel, a consultant, an outside vendor, and if they don't kind of check one of those two boxes, then they have to pass up their representation entirely. So, Asim, let me ask you this. When we were prepping, you mentioned that law firms have a particularly big challenge when it comes to protecting client data these days because the amount of data that they're handling is just constantly growing. Can you just expand on that a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, we're living in the age of exponential expansion of data. I mean, we have, most tech companies are purely, digital at this point. There's no paper, and there's a ton of email, obviously, and there's a bunch of other electronic communication systems that are just generating tons and tons and tons of data. So we're at a point now where, it's not really feasible, and this has been going on for a while, where it's not really feasible for a in-house department to call out what are maybe not relevant, not important, highly confidential, highly sensitive type emails before sending it over to the law firm. So if the law firm is receiving a lot more information than they may have received before, and it's incumbent on them to obviously continue to handle that information in a way that we would expect. And I think all of the firms try to do that and certainly have that top of mind and do make reasonable efforts given the technology that they have to use, but still I think it can be overwhelming at times for a law firm e-discovery team to just deal with the amount of information coming in, especially given that it's coming in a variety of different formats from different customers, from different clients. Some might send on CD, some might send on FTP sites. So there's a lot of data that they're dealing with there, and now it's at a point where I think a few years ago they probably knew what they had as it was coming in, but now there's just, again, so much uncalled data coming in that I think they don't really know what they have as it's coming in.
It seems like, given all of this information, it seems inevitable that some of it is going to be inadvertently disclosed to the other side. I mean, it happens all the time, and sometimes there's really nothing you can do to prevent it. Do you guys, would you recommend either using a clawback order or some kind of protective order? Do you guys do that? Is it a best practice?
Yeah, I mean, we rely on our outside counsel for that, but I mean, I think that's should be a standard part of any kind of protective order is having those clawback provisions in there. Again, I mean, I think that the firms do the best they can with the technology they have access to make sure that those things don't happen. But obviously, it does happen from time to time, and those types of provisions, I think, absolutely should be in any good protective order.
Yeah, we have a question about. Robbie, we have a question about what's best practices for firms who, in their effort to reduce costs, think reviews can be done with remote attorneys or paralegals at like $25 to $29 per hour in environments where the firm has limited control of the reviewer environment.
Well, I mean,
do you want to talk about how logical it is?
Yeah, I mean, this is a good opportunity, this is Colin, to mention that there are some tools, Logical is one of them, that will allow the firm to centralize the data and keep the data in a single location and control who has access to it. So that'll go a long ways in keeping the data safe. Now, you know, at the end of the day, if somebody is pulling a document up on their computer screen, you know, no one's going to stop them from snapping a pic with their cell phone, right? So there are definitely some trust issues there, you know, for sure. But in terms of the tech side, there are a lot of strategies that can be employed.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you.
And just as an aside, actually, I saw a statistic the other day that said that 95% of all information that has been created ever has been created in the last 18 months. So, I mean, this kind of drives home kind of the extent of, you know, of the problem that we're seeing here. So I mentioned kind of these overriding ABA rules. Of course, there are also state and industry-specific rules that can bound attorneys when it comes to data security. Again, California has a particularly pointed way of describing some of these duties. They say that the attorney must preserve client secrets, quote, at every peril to himself or herself. So it really just emphasizes the importance of this responsibility. And then when it comes to industry obligations, industry regulations, I should say, one that really stands out is in New York, where they have a series of new cybersecurity proposals that would essentially demand, if they go through, that attorneys who handle the data of financial institutions in this case, so any lawyer or law firm that's representing a bank in New York must essentially meet the very strict standards that are imposed on those banks. So that's something that's specific to the financial industry, obviously. You obviously have HIPAA regulations in the healthcare space. Asim, let me ask you this, how have the considerations for meeting your obligations to protect either your client's data when you were practicing on the law firm side or your company's data now, how has the way that you've thought about that changed over the course of your career? Because obviously a lot has changed since then.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I started, there were still times when we were reviewing documents on paper, you know, and those had to be locked up at the end of the day in a file cabinet or in a locked storage room, you know, before people left for the day. And then we slowly started moving into the world of e-discovery and reviewing those documents online on a proprietary system, you know, either a proprietary system or a system that was on premises at the law firms. So and now we're living in the world of these cloud-based review systems. So it really kind of has changed a lot over the last 10 or so years. Sorry, what was your question again? Repeat that.
No, that was my question. Just how has the way that you think you've been thinking about protecting data changed over the course of your career?
Yeah, and I think, you know, again, we're living in an age where a lot more confidential information is being, or sensitive information rather, is being transmitted via electronic means than before. You know, I mean, we have Google Docs versus Word documents, and you know, email drafts versus, again, Word documents, things like that. So that's changed a lot. You know, what's in email has really changed a lot, and what's in electronic communications has really changed a lot over the last, you know, decade or so.
Yeah, those are great points. Colin, let me ask you, what are some specific things that lawyers should be thinking about in terms of how they handle client data, and specifically, who has access to it at any given moment?
Yeah, I think the number one thing there is just know who has your data, right? If you're using a service company to process documents, to host documents, you know who is actually going to be in contact with that data, right? We have, I've been in the space for about 6 years on the services side, and very infrequently did somebody actually ask us, you know, who do you have on staff that's going to see my data, right? Have we done any background checks on those people? Is the data siloed and only being accessed as needed for processing, right? Is it going to be encrypted? Encrypting data in transit is table stakes, right? But once that data reaches your service company, are they keeping it encrypted, right? Or is it being cloned and then, you know, kept laying around in unsecure ways? So that really would be the number one, along with just hygiene, right, and the culture of security. Something that we really emphasize is making sure that everybody is actually practicing these policies, right? Policies are cheap and easy, but do you have accountability? Do you have a culture of security, at the firm?
All right, excellent. So let's move on now. We're going to spend about 10 minutes going over kind of the EDRM, which you are all obviously familiar with in theory, but we're going to look at like how data actually moves from stage to stage in the real world. And to kind of set the stage for that, I have a quote from a guy named John Martin, who some of you know. He is a prolific poster on LinkedIn, among other places, but he says, the EDRM is great for vendors and hackers.
I was waiting for what was going to be inflammatory here. All right, there we go.
Yeah, and obviously we don't all have the same view on these things. I'll say that as a caveat. But Colin, there's this kind of great quote from a recent FCC report on data security that says that data is most at risk when it is in motion. And I think it's fair to say that e-discovery is a process of motion. So what I was hoping that you could do is just kind of describe the general flow of data as it moves from the client side to the law firm side, then over to the vendors, and ultimately, over to the other side.
Yeah, definitely. So most data is being transmitted in one of two ways: either an FTP solution, and I use that phrase generally, electronic transfer, or physical media. Physical media is still extremely common, and it's surprising to me even how frequently working with customers, and they say, well, usually we send productions on a thumb drive, or we send productions on a CD or a DVD, even today. So, in terms of the client sending data to the law firm, the biggest issue there is that the data is moving at all, right? Back to that quote. There's some strategies to reduce that, but between the client and the law firm and the vendor, there's a couple really key things to keep in mind, right? One is if you're using FTP, you want to be sure it's an encrypted FTP connection. Now, again, if your law firm does not have a central, an IT person, somebody whose job that is, even a quick Google search can yield just a ton of results, right, on ways to encrypt FTP transfer. And then with physical media, I think, make sure it's encrypted, and there are a lot of tools to do that, things like BitLocker. But even more importantly, to some extent, do not transmit the password along with the physical media. And it sounds funny, right, when you hear somebody actually say that, but we, over the course of, thousands of discovery projects, every project had a transfer of data to us. Frequently that was via courier, right? And I would see encrypted hard drives with a Post-it note with a password. I would see sometimes we'd get an email and somebody says, hey, you're about to get a drive. I'm emailing you the password, and then you have that same email was printed and included in a sealed, I'll give them that much credit, a sealed envelope. So things like that, right? Be sure that you are keeping the password and any credentials or any details related to the content, right? Separate from the transmission of physical media. Now, when the law firm is sending data to a service company, that's, same, all those rules apply. But keep in mind, the service company itself may be subcontracting, and that's something that, you don't always, like Asim said, you're not always doing a complete audit on the service companies. And if you ask any questions other than who's going to handle my data, ask if they subcontract, and it's kind of part and parcel. Are they sending that data elsewhere for OCR? Are they sending it elsewhere for specific processing workflows? Is the company that's hosting the data separate from the company that's processing the data? And all the same questions apply there, right? Is that data encrypted in transit, encrypted at rest? With the review platform itself, and this is back to the question we had before. Today, there are many solutions that you can employ to make sure that the review process is as secure as possible. There should be robust logging. I can only speak for Logical, but we know when somebody downloads a document, when somebody actually downloads a native, they want to look at the formulas in the spreadsheet, we can see that, right? And there's an audit trail there. And then, to the very end, with productions, again, all the same rules apply. Productions can be high stakes, right, as we all know. And oftentimes, not ruffling any feathers can come in the way of what's really best for the client. And that's something really, really important to keep in mind. There are ways today that we can produce data without sending it out, although the transmission of data is sort of key to the discovery process, and so there's still a lot of hurdles to jump there.
Stephen, let me ask you, is what Colin's describing, did that kind of fit how you guys used to operate? I know that it was the case that you were, at Salesforce, you were relying very heavily on your outside counsel to do a lot of this work. Can you just kind of explain kind of what the workflow used to be and some of the risks that, that arose there?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a great slide. It shows the current flow. I mean, there's parts of this are not in some of the reviews. I mean, sometimes the law firm is the last link in the chain here, but it does show where the data can be sent, on CDs, on thumb drives, et cetera. And I think it's important to emphasize, obviously, that even under this model, which is, I think, the model that a lot of people still use, everybody does their best to protect the data, and everybody knows their place in this chain. And you could even blow this out a little bit at the client level. You've got somebody who's getting the information, downloading the information perhaps onto a hard drive, burning it onto a CD. So there are processes that are taking place even within these circles. But as I said, I mean, everybody's kind of doing their best to protect the data, but obviously the more times you make copies of the data, which is really kind of what's happening a lot in this chain, the law firm, they may receive a CD, and that information then may be put on their own server, unencrypted onto their own server, and so now you've got yet another copy, and then maybe they do some processing before sending it to an external vendor. So, you've got all these copies being made. You've got the data is now being replicated several times. So obviously, in any system, the more times you're replicating something, the more steps there are, the more opportunities there are for or chances there are for the process to kind of break down. So whenever we're kind of looking at this process, we always try to think of, where can we reduce risk? Where can we reduce the number of times the data is replicated? One of the things that we can do, and a lot of for our larger law firms, is they'll run their own secure FTP servers so that we can just transmit that data electronically rather than on a CD or a thumb drive. But the pressures of the legal practice that we all know, there are times when we really just have to get the documents where they need to get, and there are compromises that have to be made at times, and obviously anytime you are making any sort of compromise or, again, replicating the data, copying the data, there's a chance for there to be a hole. So that's what I would say about this old model. Or
so those are some really great,
you want to call it.
No, those are excellent points, and you did a fantastic job of speaking to some of the risks that you incur. Let me ask you this: what does having more control over the e-discovery process internally, for you, how does that translate into cost reduction?
Over having more control?
Yeah, so
you asked?
Yeah, you're doing more of this work in-house. Like, how does that translate to cost reduction?
Well, I mean, I think there's couple points to make about doing the work in-house. I mean, when we're doing the work in-house, we're not paying, we're paying for whatever system we're using to store and review the data. We're not paying our law firms to use another vendor to host the data, which costs money in and of itself, and then to use their platform as a review platform, which costs more money. So there are cost savings there. There are cost savings in terms of what a paralegal or an e-discovery person at a law firm might charge in their time to receive, process the data. That takes a lot of time to do that. The associates may be involved in that process. So where we are able to internally process and get the data ready for review, we're really cutting out the costs for whatever the firm is going to cost to charge to process and get that data ready for review, whatever their external e-discovery vendors are going to charge to process, get that data ready for review, and plus what those external vendors might charge for storage and for using a review platform to review. So there are a lot of costs that we can cut out when we do the work in-house. And, and then there's the attorney review time that we were able to cut out as well because, we are able to run targeted searches in-house, pare down the documents, and get them to a place where we're comfortable that we've got a good review set for the attorneys to review rather than them making those decisions and rather than them paring down the data.
Okay, excellent. So with that, we have about 10 or 15 more minutes left. We're going to talk about steps you can take regardless of kind of who you're using, what law firm, what vendor, steps you can take to secure your data. So, Colin, the system that we've tried to design here at Logical is one in which all data is secured at all times, regardless of if it's active, if it's on the move, if it's at rest. Can you just describe how, in this framework, how the typical discovery process unfolds here?
Yeah, absolutely. And so the model that we envision, and this goes beyond just Logical. I mean, we are definitely doing our best to materialize the theory, but the theory here is that you have the client, the end client, the original custodian of that data, is transferring that data one time, right, directly into the system in which the documents are processed, right, filtered, screened, searched, reviewed, and ultimately produced. And that is reducing all of these, we saw in the last slide, all of those points of failure, right? So you've got a single, secure discovery hub, and the law firm oftentimes controls this. Sometimes it can be the client himself that controls it, but whoever has the key to the castle is, instead of sending data around, they are controlling the flow of people, right? Controlling the flow of access. So, many times you don't just have the data kind of going through this linear process, right? Once the documents get into the review stage, you oftentimes will have, expert witnesses, right? Subject matter experts that need these documents, and I've seen many times in the past, hard drives being cloned by the dozen and sent, worldwide. And so you can eliminate, all of that risk by simply keeping the data stationary, encrypted at rest, and then invite the people in that need to see it, control the way in which they interact with the documents, what they can see, what they can't see, and then when they're finished, you simply remove their access. So there are some, there's implications across the EDRM here. I'll say lastly, with productions, something that we've done recently to address the risk there is, instead of sending documents on, again, FTP, sending documents, making copies on a hard drive, to produce documents via a secure link. And specifically in Logical, the way that we do this is the documents don't move until the receiving party actually gets that link. They are logging in securely, accessing the documents from that same repository, but in a very controlled fashion, and then pulling that down directly to their local computer or network.
So that's a great overview, Colin. Let me ask you, where do third parties, whether it's other external vendors or subject matter experts, or where do they fit into this model?
They would be accessing during the review process, right? So they would be, in this model, they would be kind of floating up somewhere on the top, right? Working usually with the law firm, sometimes with the client, but they would be basically involved during the review stage.
Okay, and Asim, obviously this is a big change from what we just saw. Can you talk to how you guys are doing e-discovery now, and how specifically how you're working with outside counsel in the course of discovery? Yeah.
So these days we are using a cloud-based review system. We're using Logical for this. It's a tool that's been approved by our internal security team. So we've done a security audit on the system and the data centers on which the SaaS system resides. So today our e-discovery team, which is a part of our security team, will upload the data directly into the Logical system for review. So the data literally does not leave our network until it's our internal secure network until it's securely uploaded to the cloud, which on Logical System, which we have also verified as being as as secure, more secure, or at least I should say at least as secure as our own systems. And then at that point, the external law firms or our colleagues around the world can then access, obviously no matter hours, they have the ability to access data that's been uploaded after it's been processed to begin their review. And, we are able to control who has access to that data at the law firm or at the, reviewer, and able to control which data they have access to and what they're able to do with that data, and then take away access when the matter is done. Obviously, as has been pointed out, somebody can always bring in a camera or make printouts, and you can never make anything foolproof, but we feel like we've really reduced the exposure of the data through really putting it directly into the cloud, into a secure cloud from our secure network. And then, we have mandated that our law firms and their reviewers use this system rather than taking the data and putting it into another system. Again, obviously the time issue is a huge issue as well. We work with counsel around the world, and the ability to have the data kind of instantaneously available rather than having it on a CD and sending it halfway around the world, having it to be processed on the other end. I mean, that's made a huge difference in terms of our ability to respond and react to critical investigations and other matters.
Well, so Asim, I was just going to ask you about this. Kind of one of the big takeaways here is if you can limit the use of physical media, and you're seeing that both, it sounds like, as a risk reduction component, and it's a big time saver, obviously. I think it's the case that you had to ship physical media back and forth between a colleague in London at one point, and I imagine you're tired of doing that.
Yeah, I mean, even within the company, it's difficult to ship or transmit large amounts of data, and sometimes you're forced to kind of do that on encrypted, highly encrypted media. It's still media that's going through the courier system. So yeah, I mean that certainly was an issue. And then in terms of obviously we have now the ability to get productions ready on ourselves without hiring an external discovery vendor to do that. And now we even when we could do that in-house, we still had to put those onto disks and other media. But now we've got the ability to simply kind of share a link with people that we're producing to. So even that's not being, the productions themselves aren't being sent on CDs anymore. Those are being transmitted over the same system and that's already been vetted by our security team. It's being transmitted that way. So now when we make a production, the person on the other end logs in and downloads the data. Obviously, they have their own obligations under the protective order or whatever agreement we've made with them. But really, we've kind of done everything we feel like we can to protect our data up until the point that they are downloading it onto their computers.
Okay, excellent. And as we move on to this next takeaway, which is encrypt all data at all times, whether it's in motion or at rest. Colin, we were talking yesterday about how all this kind of plays out in practice and how even the best laid plans, and Asim, you were kind of talking about this too, but even how the best laid plans can kind of go out the window when you're on deadline, when you have a fire drill, whatever it may be. Can you just talk about that a little bit more, Colin?
Yeah, sure. So, again, it's very easy to say that data should be encrypted, and it sounds obvious, but, I've seen firsthand situations, or I've talked to customers that have been in situations where, you have a production deadline, and I'm sure everyone attending today has experienced this. There are times when it's right down to the wire, and I've heard and seen people actually have to make that decision between, do I meet my production deadline or do I properly encrypt the data, right? Encrypting the 100 gigabytes of production data is going to add another 8 hours to the process, or even 2 hours to the process. And so that's a really unfortunate position that people find themselves in. So to tack onto that, we often will find that people generally take the path of least resistance. Not all attorneys are technical wizards, right? Not all attorneys really understand what it means to properly encrypt data. And so we want to be sure that the path of least resistance, which is commonly taken, is also the most secure.
Okay, excellent. And our final takeaway here is apply strict access control. So whether this is things like two-factor authentication, permissions-based users, applying strong passwords. Colin, I'll ask you to talk about that in a second. But Asim, I wanted to ask you, what are you guys doing now to make sure that both internal users and outside users, whether it's external vendors or outside counsel, have access to the appropriate materials, and they only have access to that stuff?
Well, I mean, I think it starts with the way in which we process the data internally after we collect it. I mean, we collect the data, we download it, and we run our own searches and things like that on it before we get it ready for doing by external outside counsel or their reviewers. So, I mean, that's a big thing that we're doing to make sure that only the data that that needs to be reviewed is going out there. Another thing that we're doing is, as I mentioned, we're mandating that our outside counsel use Logical to do their document reviews, and it's as is common practice in some litigations, they'll hire contract reviewers to do the reviews. So we were able to set it up in such a way that we only give the contract reviewers access to specific documents that they are going to be reviewing, rather than the whole review set. So there are a lot of different things that we can do to make sure that the minimum number of eyes are looking at this data. And we control that, and our law firms have the responsibility to control it as well, but at least we have visibility into that process, whereas before it was a bit of a black box.
Right, that makes a lot of sense. And Colin, we have about 2 minutes left, but I know having strong passwords is a passion of yours. Can you just talk about the importance of that and some of the practical steps that people on this call can kind of apply right now in that regard?
Yeah, sure. So as an exercise, just stop and ask yourself, how many logins do you use on a daily basis? How many web portals are you signing into between personal work? And if any one of those passwords is compromised, your entire suite could be at risk, right? So not only is it critical to use a strong password, but a different password for each of these various services, and that can be pretty daunting. So I will gladly plug tools like LastPass, and I think they've got some competitors that might be pretty good too. But LastPass is software. It will automatically generate randomized passwords that are effectively unguessable. Even in a case of a social engineering attack or somebody really doing their homework to try to crack the passwords, it'll predict from that. It has the added benefit of being centralized, so a law firm can have an account with something like LastPass, and the IT department can actually control people's access to not just discovery tools, but everything, right? Email, whatever the case may be.
All right, so that is going to wrap up our presentation. Asim, I want to thank you very much for joining us and for all the great advice you gave to our attendees. It was a pleasure having you here.
Sure, thank you.
And Mary, I'll turn it back over to you. I do want to call attention to the email addresses that you see on your screen. If you have any questions, if you want to hear more about Logical, or if you have any questions about CLE, please reach out to either myself or Colin, and we'll be happy to get in touch with you. And Mary, thanks a lot for giving us this platform. We appreciate it.
Well, we're just thrilled to have you here, Robbie, and I want to thank Asim and Colin and yourself for a fantastic webinar. Please reach out to them. Their email is on the screen for those of you who are listening, robert.hilson@logical, LOGIKCULL.com, or Colin Seze at the same address, colin.seze@logical.com. I love that spelling. And we'll have a copy of the presentation up within the next 24 hours with the link. And CLE, contact Colin or Robbie. And I want to thank you all and thank everybody for attending. Bye-bye.